Welcome to this segment of KWBSM News.
Today is April 24th, 1945. We're coming to you live from the great state of Florida.
Today's current event topic is the Cold War. Starting off, we have Joelle to speak to us about our economy.
Chapter 36, the Cold War begins from the period of 1945 to 1952. Post-war, the American society was scarred. The suicide rates were rising and the marriage rates were declining, as well as the gross national production rate from 1946 to 47. Prices for goods and production went up 33% through that time period with the removal of wartime prices. Organized labor was rising as well and upsetting conservatives. A Republican-controlled Congress, the first in many years, passed the Taft-Hartley Act over President Truman's veto, which outlawed closed union shops and made unions liable for damages resulting in jurisdictional disputes and required union leaders to take anti-communist oaths. This act slowed the growth of organized labor in America. Unions became huge in manufacturing industries such as steel and automobile, and in the Northeast, they were successful, but not so much in the South and West. The CIO's Operation Dixie aimed to unionize Southern textile and steel workers, but failed because of fear of racial mixing. Inside of the service sector, unionization was much more difficult. The service sector, which was made up of primarily women, middle-aged, working part-time. The government administration secured passage of the Employment Act in 1946, which promoted maximum employment and production of purchasing power. Of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944 was shocking and also known as the GI Bill. It made provisions for sending former soldiers to school because the United States government feared that the employment markets would not absorb these veterans, and enabled the Veterans Administrations to form and guarantee 16 billion loans to vets in order for them to live. The economic boom of 1950 to 1970 allowed for economic growth in America to plateau for 20 years. In the 1950s, the income doubled, and in the 1960s, the income doubled again. This was a time of prosperity within the American economy. It molded the political agenda, it allowed for social mobility, it paved the way for civil rights movement, and it allowed for new welfare programs to emerge like Medicare, and gave Americans the confidence it needed to engage in international leadership during the Cold War era. Americans hungered for more of life's luxury, a two-car garage, swimming pool out back, and the like. The size of the middle class doubled. It now included 60% of Americans within this time period. And by the end of the decade, 90% of American families owned TVs, cars, and washing machines. Employment opportunities for women also skyrocketed within this time as the service sector outgrew the industry and manufacturing systems in place. Women made up 1/4 of the workforce at the end of World War II and accounted for half of that within the next 5 years to come. With this growth in employment for women, a clash began to emerge between the projection of the traditional housemaking suburban wife that was being portrayed within popular culture and the realities of the working class woman. Post-war prosperity had its roots in the Second World War. Huge military budgets made way for the financing of scientific research. Production increased throughout the United States as war was going on, while in other countries the economy was declining. And because of this war, America was able to dominate the global economy post-war. The second root of post-war prosperity lies within the desire for cheap energy. America and Europe controlled the petroleum flow of the Middle East, and this consumption of petroleum doubled after the war and created loads of highways and AC vents in order to feed into this. Productivity increased after the Korean War 3% every year. It was enhanced by rising educational levels of the workforce and doubled the standard of living. The third and final root of post-war prosperity lies in the change in economic structure. The workforce was moving out of traditional means of agriculture and becoming increasingly mechanized, and productivity gains were uncanny because of this. The consolidation of giant agricultural businesses resulted from this mechanization. Now the Sun Belt. The distances Post-war migration and redistribution increased, and after 1945, an average of 30 million people change residency every year. The distances of migration divided families and friendships. This is evidenced in the increase in advice books on children rearing, such as Dr. Benjamin Stock's Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, which was published in 1945. The price for mobility often led to loneliness and isolation for those who chose to go down that road. The Sun Belt grew. The Sun Belt was a 15-state area from Virginia to Florida and Texas to Arizona and California, and it formed a smiling crescent. So it became known as the Smiling Sun Belt. The population in this region doubled more than in the industrial zones. In California alone was 1/5 of the nation's population, and the growth by 1963 made it the most populous state. Migrants to the South and the Southwest were in search of jobs because there was an abundance in the electronics industry. In Florida and Texas, there was an abundance of jobs in aero and space complexes and military bases. These migrants were in search of better jobs, better climate, and lower taxes. Growth resulting in this migration took a lot of government dollars, and these new states received much more funding than those other industrial states. Along with the migration westward, a lot of people in the north were taking the white flight from urban areas to suburban neighborhoods. Government policies encouraged movements away from urban areas. The federal housing admissions and the veterans admission gave home loans that made it economically attractive to own suburban homes. Tax deductions for interest payments on home mortgages were offered, and mass migration was facilitated by highways. 1 in 4 Americans lived in the suburbs. Construction boomed because of this mass movement. And this movement was pioneered by the Levitt brothers. The first Levittown, a suburban community, sprouted on New York's Long Island in the 1940s. Home construction techniques were revolutionized because of this flight towards suburbs. Specialized crews kind of copied the styles of the assembly line previously practiced in industrial factories and cut costs and time in creating these communities. Blacks filled up urban neighborhoods as the whites moved out, and they brought with them the poverty that they'd experienced in the South. Tax-paying businesses also fled from urban communities to suburban neighborhoods, and the creation of shopping malls resulted in that. This white flight and separation from urban neighborhoods to suburban neighborhoods resulted in residential segregation and limited the black mobility. The FHA viewed giving blacks loans to buy homes in suburban neighborhoods as a risk because of their demographically low standing, financial-wise. And this residential segregation further solidified with the government housing created for black people within predominantly black neighborhoods.
1945, the birth rate in the U.S. reached its peak. This time is known as the baby boom. By the end of the 1950s, over 50 million babies had been born, and then in 1973, the birth rate actually declined. After the boom, people were actually not having enough babies to maintain a reasonable American population. President Harry S. Truman was elected, and he was known kind of like a public figure. He didn't have a college degree, so people could relate to him more, and he was seen as the average man's man. That's a term that a lot of people use to describe him. And he wasn't afraid of issues. Other presidents became flustered by different issues that arose during the time periods, but he accepted the issues as a challenge. He looked to fix them right away. He wasn't scared about it. He had a lot of courage when it came to solving issues. Yalta, bargain or betrayal. In 1945, a group known as the election status of Romania, Bulgaria, and Poland, and determined that all 3 of those areas would have free elections. Stalin ended up actually breaking the agreement, so then they met again to make peace negotiations again. The second peacekeeping organization was known as the United Nations League. They were really at loss when it came to the Far East. They weren't really sure what to do, so they devised a plan that Stalin would attack Japan after the collapse of Germany, because America didn't want to directly fight Japan because they knew that they'd lose a lot of American lives. If Stalin agreed to follow through with his plans, the Soviets in return would be given the southern part of Sakhalin one island. Adding to that, Soviets were also given control of railroads in Manchuria, and they were also given privileges to seaports in that area, so they got trading privileges in 2 seaports in the area of Manchuria. The first seaport was named Darien and the second seaport Port Arthur. And because he had the 2 areas where he had control over Manchuria, control over the railroads and the seaports, he gained privileges to vital parts of other areas involved in manufacturing and industry. So pretty much he gained power over key centers of industry in China. The Yalta Conference was never really a secure thing. It wasn't definite, like this person will get this person will get this. It was never like that. It was more where the 3 came together and they kind of just discussed things. Nothing was really definite, and no kind of walked over Moscow when Moscow asked for a loan from the US, considering the fact that they gave a loan to Britain for $6 billion for reconstruction purposes, and not Moscow when they asked for / needed it. They kind of established bad relations with Moscow because they did that, and the US denied, or they decided not to give Moscow that loan. But then they went ahead and acknowledged Britain's appeal for a loan, and they gave that loan to them, so they kind of walked over Moscow in that sense. Although some may look at it as fair, Britain asked for a loan that was almost half of what Moscow asked for. Britain appealed for a loan that was $3.75 billion, and Moscow asked for a loan that was $6 billion. In order to ensure their security if any other conflicts or problems arose, the USSR created the spheres of influence, which was pretty much surrounding countries. They considered them friends and kind of formed allies with them, so if anything happens, they would have those people to go to. And this contradicted FDR's policy of an open world where everyone was peaceful and everyone was nice to each other and friendly with each other, because the USSR was only considering the countries around their sphere of influence as the people they were friendly with, essentially, in a sense. So it contradicted his open world policy. This actually provoked the Soviet Union and the US into like this tense situation because they weren't that much different. They were different, so it caused tension, and this led to the 40-year Cold War. Now on to Veronica.
Thank you, Kayla. Recently, some of the top leaders in the world got together in New Hampshire at the Bretton Woods Conference. We are now finally able to easily regulate currency exchange rate with other countries, thanks to the International Monetary Fund. Our government has also founded the International Bank, which will help economic growth in war-crazy and underdeveloped areas. It's about time. The United Nations opened on April 18th. The permanent powers include China, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and the USA. The Senate overwhelmingly approved the United Nations by a vote of 89-2. The United Nations has already begun making this world a better place. They have created UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the World Health Organization. These will bring many benefits to citizens across the globe. Now on to the problems in Germany. The Nuremberg trials are currently occurring. Punishment of 22 thought to be culprits of the Holocaust are currently being investigated. It has been confirmed that Germany will remain indefinitely divided. Berlin has been recently cut off from all air and railway access, leaving them without supplies. Their allies were luckily able to take an airlift to feed the people of Berlin. Now, on to the Cold War, since you guys know that we are currently in the Cold War as we speak. So, a new war policy has been created by Truman, stating that firm containment of Soviet expansion would halt communist power, formerly known as the Containment Policy. After much controversy, the policy has quickly become known as the Truman Doctrine, which means you can aid any power fighting communist aggression. Traveling back to Western Europe, which includes Europe, France, Italy, and Germany, are still in shambles. The Secretary of State, George Marshall, has come up with the Marshall Plan to save the helpless areas. So far, Western Europe is what has become known as the miraculous recovery in history. Europe, France, Italy, and Germany are now known as the European Community. Since we have now been attempting to get back on our feet from World War II, we have recently installed some new security systems. The 1947 National Security Act created our very own Department of Defense, as well as the National Security Council. Now, some on news from the media. Tune in to our new radio broadcast station called Voice of America. for live military jobs. You can be randomly called to the war if extra bodies are needed. Unfortunately, this has the potential to destroy many young people's career choices. This system is known as the selective service system. Now on to Korea.
Now traveling to Japan, the reconstruction in here is simpler than in Germany because it's a one-man show by Douglas MacArthur. As we know, his democratization is inflexible as he makes hanging and imprisoning terms for war crimes available. Agreeing to MacArthur's ideas, as we know, sped the end of the occupation. Our new constitution includes renouncing militarism, providing for women's equality, and introducing Western-style government. Even though we may be a success story, as we travel to China, they definitely aren't one. Here in China, the civil war between the nationalists and communists has been dragging. Chinese national government of Generalismo Slang Cixi was forced to flee as China's own communist forces, led by Mao Zedong, defeated the nationalists. 1/4 of the population now were beginning to fall into communist ways. Going to America, President Truman, critics blamed him for not supporting the nationalists enough. Truman announces that the Soviets just recently exploded their first atomic bomb. This just eliminated the U.S. monopoly on nuclear weapons, which most likely occurred because of the spy. It is now 1952, and the U.S. exploded the hydrogen bomb, which the Soviets followed, and now we have begun the dangerous race of this Cold War. To backtrack, before this, the U.S. formed the Loyalty Review Board as an anti-red chase. Communists violated the Smith Act and were convicted and sent to prison by the jury. Committee on Un-American Activities were established to investigate the subversion. Joseph McCarthy was bursting into the scene and charged that there were scores of unknown communists. But this wasn't proven, and Americans continued to fear that the chase was going too far. Continuing in America, the Republicans are now currently in control of the House of Representatives. Dewey and Truman were nominated in the election. This split the Democratic Party, and a new progressive party formed in this election. Shockingly, Truman won the war, even though the Democrats were disorganized, so many people couldn't believe that this actually had happened. Truman created the 4 points, which were financial support of the poor land to keep underprivileged people from turning into communists. As well, he also made the New Deal, but it calls for many things that it didn't really succeed in. And it only really succeeded in improving housing and raising minimum wage. The Americans and Russians withdrew from Korea, which meant that they were leaving weapons and their rivals, the North and South. The North invaded the South by surprise, and Truman came to action to help the South. MacArthur then came to the rescue and invaded and drove North Korea back across the 38th parallel. But sadly, his confidence misled him, and the Chinese, the supposedly volunteers, flooded across the border and pushed them back to the 38th parallel. Truman removed MacArthur from command due to disagreements about increasing the size of the war. And as this continued, truce discussions began finally coming into play.
Thank you for tuning in.
And catch us next time on
KWSM News.